Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
It is good to have everybody with us for our Dr. Lewis and Felice Schrager Memorial Lecture this year. It is nice to have hybrid be in a little bit of reverse this year from last year, and that there might be more people in the room than we had last year, and that our speakers actually in the room this year too, as opposed to last year when Ambassador Eisen was online instead. So it's good to have our speaker with us this morning. Before I introduce our speaker, I'm going to call up Victoria Schrager, who's going to talk about her parents a little bit, in which this lecture is a memorial.
Thanks for coming, everybody. Just to reiterate how important the temple was to my parents, is I think everybody in the room probably knows. And I think it's really in part thanks to Larry getting bar mitzvah that Rabbi Fields recognized kind of a scholar and a curious spiritual nature in my dad. And I think that that's what really drew him to become interested in being more involved as a Jew. And my mother came right along for the ride. Having grown up in Vienna, they weren't particularly religious. My grandparents on my dad's side had come from Poland, so they were from the shtetl, but they pretty much were shedding that, like many in their time. And so I think Anshe Emeth really appealed to my parents because they were looking for not just a spirituality, but also something they could connect to intellectually. And I think being here gave them that opportunity and enriched all of our lives. And so it's our pleasure to present our speaker today. And thank you all for coming.
Years ago, when I took over for Rabbi Miller, almost immediately, Felice scheduled an appointment with me to talk about what type of speaker she wanted for the Schrager Memorial Lectures. And the one thing that she made abundantly clear without any wiggle room of understanding, because that was Felice, was that it had to push us. The speaker had to have an academic background that really challenged us and forced us to grow and think about the world in a different way. And we've had multiple speakers over the years who have really challenged our notion of how do we understand democracy in America, or politics in Israel, or how do we interpret the 2016 or 2020 elections and whatnot. And we've had wonderful speakers come in. And when talking to Larry and Victoria about who we should bring in this year, the first name that came to mind was Dr. Dov Waxman. I had just listened to a podcast, I believe it was with you and Yehuda Kurtzer, which just was riveting. It led me to your book, Trouble in the Tribe. And I think right now, especially in the reform movement, we are really wrestling with how do we connect with Israel as being a progressive movement. And I can't think of anybody better than Dr. Waxman who can help us wrestle with that. As far as I'm aware and concerned, you are the leading thought leader on this. Dr. Waxman received his PhD and master's from Johns Hopkins University and his BA from Oxford University. As soon as you start hearing him talk, you'll understand that. He's the author of 4 books, including the one I just mentioned, Trouble in the Tribe, The American Jewish Conflict Over Israel, and has been published multiple times in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, the Atlantic, and is the go-to person when dealing with this topic of how do we deal and relate with Israel and how do we understand Zionism for a new age. I'm unbelievably excited to call up Dr. Waxman for a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me at the back okay? Great. I want to say what a pleasure it is, first of all, to be here. Thank you for the very kind introduction, and for bringing me here, because I'm used to giving talks now over Zoom, and so it's so nice to actually be in the room with you all and the people on the screen as well, but particularly to be here in person and to see your faces and to be able to talk about this subject in person. It's so important. And obviously a lot is happening in the United States and what's been going on in Israel lately, and I'm sure we will talk about a little bit about the Israeli election and the next government. I'll save that for questions. What I wanted to do in my talk is really address a question that has, I think, dominated in many ways the American Jewish conversation about Israel for some time now. And it's a question of the relationship between American Jews and Israel, and specifically between liberal American Jews and Israel, Jews who are both liberal politically and or liberal religiously. And there's often been this claim, I'm sure you've heard it many times, that liberal American Jews are growing ever more distant and estranged from Israel. And that the two communities, Israel and at least much of the American Jewish community, are basically drifting apart. So the question I want to address then is that true? Is this notion of a rift true? What does it mean? And what can be done about it? I probably won't get that much time to talk about what can be done about it, but I'd be happy in the questions to follow to kind of give you some of my thoughts on that. But what I wanted to do then today is just head on address this question of, are liberal American Jews, which is of course the majority of the Jewish community here, are they abandoning Israel? Are they becoming distanced from Israel, as many fear? Interestingly enough, this is one topic, one question that those on both sides of the political spectrum, both ends of the political spectrum, actually agree on. That there's just general agreement that there is this alienation taking place. So on the one hand, you have the kind of liberal commentator like Peter Beinart, who has argued very famously in an essay in the New York Review of Books. He argued that there's distancing, as it's called, from Israel is really driven by the American Jewish commitment to liberalism, right? It's basically, according to Beinart, because of the growing tension between the liberal values and political views of American Jews and the Israeli government's right-wing illiberal policies. Beinart argues that this is what's alienating American Jews from Israel. On the other end of the political spectrum, the conservative commentator Daniel Gordis, you may have heard, he lives in Jerusalem, he's also argued that liberal American Jews are becoming alienated from Israel. But unlike Beinart, who argues that the reason for this is the policies of Israeli governments, Gordis argues that it's not what Israeli governments are doing that's driving this alienation, but rather what Israel is, the nature of Israel. Specifically, according to Gordis, it's because Israel is not a liberal democracy in the way that the United States is, a state for all of its citizens, in which all citizens have an equal status and standing and claim upon the state. Rather, Israel is an ethnic democracy. It is set up for Jews, and that is its primary purpose, is to be a homeland and a nation state for the Jewish people. And Gordis argues that this aspect, this nature of Israel, is something that essentially disturbs the liberal sensibilities and values of American Jews and alienates them from Israel. So both commentators on the left and on the right agree that there's this alienation taking place. And I think they both make good points, right? I think it's true that many liberal American Jews, as I will discuss, are unhappy with what Israel does. And it's also true that some American Jews, especially younger ones, are uncomfortable with what Israel is, not just with what it does. But I think both commentators exaggerate the extent of American Jewish alienation from Israel. I think they exaggerate the degree of alienation. If you look at the survey data, I'm a political scientist, so I like to look at data. I like to look at survey data to really get a sense, not anecdotally from what we just hear, but rather to see how American Jews actually identify and what their actual feelings are and attitudes towards Israel. And Fortunately for me, there is a lot of survey data on this particular question. This is a question that has been asked of American Jews, you know, how close do you feel to Israel, how attached you are, for decades now, right? Both by Jewish organizations like the American Jewish Committee, which has an annual survey on this, as well as major polling organizations. And I think the one that's really the gold standard in terms of surveys of American Jews is the one carried out by the Pew Research Center. You may have heard about this, right? They did one in 2013. It was the largest survey of its kind of the American Jewish community. And they did another survey in 2020. So let's just look at what the data tells us, right? In their most recent, in the 2020 survey, 58% of American Jews said they felt very or somewhat attached to Israel. A majority, clear majority. 57% said they follow news about Israel very or somewhat closely. 45% said that caring about Israel is essential to what being Jewish meant to them. And an additional 37% said it was important but not essential. Just 16% in that survey said that caring about Israel is not important to their Jewish identity. Okay, so in other words, a solid majority of American Jews identifies, is attached to Israel, believes that Israel is important to their Jewish identity, and follows news about Israel either very closely or somewhat closely. That is not the statistics that point to widespread alienation. Now, it is true that that survey does show that there are differences within the American Jewish community when it comes to attachment to Israel. So it is true that Orthodox American Jews, as is probably no surprise, are the most attached, right? They make up about 10% of the American Jewish community. People often imagine much more, but actually just about 10%. And they are certainly the most emotionally attached to Israel than are other Jews. Conservative Jews also tend to be more attached than Reform Jews, who tend to be more attached than unaffiliated. So there are differences across the denominations, right? But as I said, the difference is from being very attached to being attached, not to being disconnected. It's also true that older Jews are more attached to Israel than are younger Jews. So 2/3 of Jews aged 65 and older, 2/3, said they were very or somewhat attached to Israel, compared with 48% of those aged 18 to 29. So there's a difference. Only 35% of Jews under the age of 30 thought that caring about Israel was essential to being Jewish, compared to 52% of those over the age of 65. So you can see that there is a generational gap clearly there. And interestingly, and this is new, there's always been a generational gap. In all of the surveys over many years, older Jews have always expressed a stronger sense of attachment to Israel than younger Jews, and Orthodox Jews have typically expressed a stronger attachment. So there isn't any great change there. The one area where there has been change from one survey to the next, from 2013 to 2020, is in the attachment expressed by Jews who identify politically as liberals versus those who identify politically as conservatives. So in the most recent survey, 7 out of 10 Jews who vote for the Republican Party or independents who lean Republican, 7 out of 10, 72%, said they were very or somewhat attached to Israel, compared with about half of Jews who vote for the Democrat or Democrat-leaning Jews, 52%. So there's a gap there, right? Not just in terms of denomination or age, but now political. And I'm going to return to that at the end, because I think that emerging gap is significant, and that is new. But it's still true that as of today, most religiously and politically liberal American Jews, as I've said, are attached to Israel, but less so than their conservative counterparts. So there is this gap, okay? Now, for the minority of Jews who aren't attached, as I said, I read those statistics consistently, there's roughly about 30%, okay? 30% who aren't attached. Is that because they are politically alienated? Is it because they're taking issue with what Israel does? No, if you look at who those Jews are, they are also those who who are least involved, least connected with the Jewish community, with Jewish life. Okay, they are most likely to be unaffiliated. Okay, then with any denomination, with any synagogue, with any Jewish organization. Okay, they're most likely to be the most secular, and basically the most assimilated. In other words, their lack of attachment to Israel isn't a result of political alienation from Israel, right? Rather, it is a result of alienation from Jewish life, right? It is because they're less involved in Jewish life in general, and therefore they're less attached to Israel. Okay. The majority, though, of American Jews who are, as I said, religiously and politically liberal are still today attached to Israel. But that doesn't mean, okay, that nothing has changed in their relationship with Israel. What I'm going to argue then is that a profound change has taken place, but it's not the one that's often described as this process of distancing or alienation. But I'm going to get at the end to suggest that that may well be the case in the future. Okay, so that's where I'm going to go with this. So what has changed? Well, I think the major change that's taken place is not that Jews have disengaged from Israel, but that they are critically engaging with Israel. Okay? Now, before I get into this shift, this change in the way that Jews engage with Israel and the nature of their engagement, I think it's first of all important to gain some historical perspective on this, right? To understand how our relationship with Israel has evolved over time, because it's important to appreciate the fact that our relationship with Israel has never been static or fixed, okay? It's always changed, it's always been evolving from even before Israel's establishment. And it's been evolving and changing in response to what's been happening in Israel, to changes in Israel, to changes in the United States itself, and to changes within the American Jewish community. All three of these things affect how American Jews relate and engage with Israel. What's happening in Israel, what's happening within the American Jewish community, and what's happening in the United States. So in the early years of Israeli statehood, from 1948 to 1967, Israel wasn't actually of much concern to American Jews. Many people might be surprised because they kind of think of the more recent period as the norm, and they forget the fact that actually in the 1950s and early 1960s, Israel wasn't particularly important to American Jews. It wasn't nearly as prominent in American Jewish life as it subsequently became. 1950s and early 60s was a time of upward mobility for American Jews. It was a time of suburbanization and assimilation. And for most American Jews at that time, their own needs are for economic prosperity, for security, for belonging in the United States took precedence. Remember, that was a time when American Jews still faced widespread discrimination and anti-Semitism in the 1950s and in the early 60s. And so they were really preoccupied with their own needs rather than the needs of a foreign country thousands of miles away. Okay. They were also worried about expressing support or attachment to this foreign country thousands of miles away, because this was also a time in the 1950s where expressing attachment or loyalty to another country could evoke accusations of dual loyalty, right? The claim that Jews are disloyal. Remember, this was also the high point of anti-communist sentiment in the United States during the Cold War. So it really wasn't until the Six-Day War of 1967 that transformed the American Jewish relationship with Israel, had this major impact. The fear preceding that war, in the days and weeks leading up to it, the fear of a second Holocaust, the fear that Jews in Israel would be wiped out. This was, remember, they were digging mass graves in Tel Aviv in anticipation of that war. That fear, followed by the relief, the jubilation felt that Israel not only survived, but triumphed so quickly and so decisively, that really led to an outpouring of support for Israel within the Jewish community. Support for Israel came to dominate American Jewish public life and politics. It became an essential part of Jewish education in the United States and of congregational life. And in many ways, in the decade that followed, again, a time of assimilation and secularization, supporting Israel became really the one thing that American Jews had in common. They no longer agreed about religion. They no longer shared religious practices or observance, but Israel was the thing that could bring American Jews together. Questioning Israel's actions, its policies, was basically forbidden, right? Basically not something you could do. Certainly, you weren't allowed to do that in public. Public criticism of Israel was very rare, and even in private, it was frowned upon, because the prevailing attitude was that it's really not our place as Jews living in the diaspora. This was true, as you noted, I grew up in the United Kingdom. It's true in the UK as well. It's true across the Jewish diaspora. The sense that we don't live there, we don't have a right to criticize, right? It's not our lives that are on the line. It's not our children who are serving in the IDF, okay? That period of time, from 1967, for about the next decade or so, okay, that was really the kind of golden age, in some respects, of this relationship, where Israel was venerated, almost idolized within the American Jewish community. And it was a result of numerous developments. I've already mentioned one, the 1967 war, Israel's kind of miraculous victory in that. There was also, of course, the Yom Kippur War as well in 1973, and numerous terrorist attacks, very major terrorist attacks. Think about the seizure, the kidnapping and murder of Israeli athletes in 1972 at the Munich Olympics, or the hijacking and the rescue in Entebbe in 1970s. These events, these two wars and other terrorist attacks, really led to this outpouring of support. Israel was clearly being victimized, was being attacked by its enemies. Jews were being attacked. But it wasn't just what was happening to Israel, to Israelis or to Jews that generated this support. There were also, as I said, it was also a result of changes in American society and in American Jewish identity. A couple in particular I think are important. First of all, growing awareness of the Holocaust. As the consciousness of what had happened during the Holocaust became more and more widespread, it didn't happen overnight. Really, this starts to happen in the 1960s after the capture of Adolf Eichmann, and much more attention being paid to the experiences of Jewish survivors. Okay, gradually, Holocaust consciousness, awareness of that really impacts American Jews and American society in general, and that in turn encourages growing support for Israel. And the other major development during this period that encouraged that was the rise of what we might call identity politics, broadly speaking. I'm talking about a time when African Americans, Native Americans, gays, lesbians, and many others begin to publicly affirm their difference, their identities, and to demand recognition of their own identities and differences. Okay, so it becomes fashionable, not just acceptable, but fashionable then for Jews to openly affirm their identities as Jews and their support for Israel. They're no longer worried that overt displays of support for Israel might provoke accusations of dual loyalty. Okay, so in other words, the environment becomes much more hospitable for the expression of Zionism in American life, because there's this greater acceptance of ethnic identities and of everybody's various identities. And finally, during this period, supporting Israel was seen as wholly in accordance with the liberal values and beliefs, and even left-wing values and beliefs of particularly young American Jews who came of age during this period. Because for them, what they saw from afar was an Israel that was egalitarian, progressive, and secular, one that was ruled by labor governments. It had female soldiers and socialist kibbutzim, right? So if you looked at Israel like that, it appeared to be a country that was committed to social democracy, to economic and gender equality, and above all, committed to peace. And so it was easy to support Israel, even to idealize Israel from afar. So American Jews fell in love during the 1960s and 70s with Israel, but already by the late 70s, the love affair starts to change, right? So this decade, as I said, was really the high point. From the late 1970s onwards, right, much earlier than we tend to think, okay, really the romance has been wearing off from the late 70s onwards, and a process of what I would call disillusionment has gradually taken place. And there are, again, multiple reasons for this. Part of it was that Israel appeared to change in ways that disappointed, even angered, more secular and liberal American Jews. They didn't see it any longer as that peace-seeking, social democratic, egalitarian country. Rather, they start to see it in less attractive terms from the late 70s. The victory, the surprise victory of the Likud party, then led by Menachem Begin in the 1977 election, was one of the things that starts to shift perceptions of Israel. Israel now seems to be more right-wing, less socialist, less egalitarian. The invasion of Lebanon in 1982 and the Lebanon War, followed by the first Palestinian Intifada in the late 1980s. This shifts the perception of Israel. It's no longer seen as just that peace-seeking, innocent victim of the conflict. And so these events undermine the idealized image of Israel held by many American Jews and leads to this process of growing alienation. As I said, the Arab-Israeli conflict also begins to change. Essentially, after Israel's peace agreement with Egypt, the attention starts to shift away from the conflict between Israel and the Arab states, a conflict in which Israel is widely perceived as the underdog, the David to the Arab Goliath. Instead, particularly as a result of the first Intifada, right, there's a focus now on the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, not Israel and the Arabs. And in that conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, rather than the Arab-Israeli one, in that conflict, Israel is now perceived as the Goliath to the Palestinian David. Israel is no longer seen as embattled, heroic, this plucky little country standing up to the might of the Arab world. Rather, Israel is increasingly perceived as the military power, as an oppressor of Palestinians and an occupier of their territories. So changes in how Israel is perceived and in what Israel's doing. But there's also changes taking place in how American Jews engage with Israel. So in the earlier era, in the 50s and 60s, American Jews really fell in love with an imaginary Israel, a mythical country, right? It was the Israel of Exodus, the novel, and the movie, not the Exodus story. It was Israel as envisaged, right, by, you know, the idea of the Saba was Ari Ben Canaan, played by Paul Newman, right? That was the kind of idealized Israel that captured the American Jewish imagination. In many ways, Israel was a screen on which we could project our own fantasies and our own fears. And remember, during that period of time, before the internet, before even cable TV, right, people knew very little about Israel. Very little. Very few Jews went to Israel. It was a long way away, and it took a long time to get there, and it was very expensive, right? And very few American Jews knew enough Hebrew to read about what was happening in Israel, because only the Jerusalem Post was in English. All the other Israeli newspapers at the time only had Hebrew editions. You had to be pretty devoted to Israel to get a subscription of the Jerusalem Post. It would take weeks to arrive, right? So there really wasn't an easy way for American Jews, even if they were inclined to follow what was happening in Israel, to do so. It was difficult for them to follow what was happening. In more recent decades, by contrast, there's been, first of all, a huge increase in travel to Israel. So in 1970, just 14% of American Jews had visited Israel once, just 14%. That rose to 27% in 1990, to 35% in the year 2000, and most recently in 2020, 45%. Okay, so you can see there's a real growth. more Jews are going to Israel. Not only are they visiting Israel more, they're also paying much closer attention to what's happening there, right, than ever before. In the internet age, it's easy for us to learn about what's happening in Israel, right? We can read Israeli newspapers in English, right? All the Israeli newspapers now have English language websites. In addition to that, there is a lot of scrutiny of Israel's actions and behavior in the media, right? A lot of reporting on what Israel does. Human rights organizations pay very close attention to what Israel is doing, maybe much closer attention to what Israel is doing than to some other states. All of this means that we've gotten to know Israel a lot better. And as we've gotten to know Israel a lot better, those aspects of Israel that conflict with our own beliefs and values, we're becoming more aware of those, right? So we're gradually developing a less romantic and more realistic view of the country. We're not looking at Israel through those rose-tinted lenses that we once were. And as American Jews have gradually discovered the real Israel, that is never going to be as good as the Israel of your imagination, right? There's an inevitable disillusionment that's going to set in, okay? But this disillusionment did not lead to alienation, However dismayed liberal American Jews were by the actions of Israeli governments, particularly Likud-led governments, they didn't distance themselves from Israel. They remained attached to Israel, even as they became more critical of its policies. And this is because caring about Israel doesn't necessarily mean agreeing with its policies or liking its governments, okay? It's very important to distinguish between emotional attachment on the one hand and political support for Israeli governments on the other hand, and not to just collapse these two things together. Being emotionally distant from Israel means being apathetic about it, not thinking about it, not caring about it, right? Not paying attention to what it's doing. That's very different from being opposed to Israeli government policies. If you're opposed to those policies, it means you're thinking about it, you're paying some attention, right? And at least for many critics, Jewish critics of Israel, you're also caring about Israel. That's why you're opposed to its government's policies. So one can be strongly opposed to a country's policies and actions, but still feel strongly attached to the country, just as many Americans feel about the United States, right? So the central thesis of my book, Traveling the Tribe, which came out a few years ago, was that the shift that's taken place is away from this era of kind of Israel right or wrong, right? Away from a time of unquestioning, uncritical support for Israel, a time that was marked by deference to Israeli governments and acquiescence with its policies. Instead, over the last few decades, as I said, this has been a long-term process. This didn't happen when Prime Minister Netanyahu entered office and re-entered office a decade or so ago. Right? It didn't just happen as a result of the Second Intifada. This is a long-term process of gradually becoming less deferential toward Israeli governments and more critical, more assertive, right? So American Jews aren't any longer willing to kind of accept whatever Israeli governments do and send their money to Israel and lobby on its behalf. Instead, they want to have a bigger say in Israel's future. They want their opinions heard. The taboo that I mentioned before against criticism of Israel, that taboo has ended, clearly, okay? Criticism has not really gone mainstream. Even establishment organizations like the AJC or the Anti-Defamation League criticize Israeli governments from time to time nowadays. It's not merely happening occasionally, it's happening daily, constantly. There's a constant chorus of criticism, especially of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians and of its policies in the West Bank. So American Jews are no longer willing to blindly accept what Israel's doing, and they're increasingly willing to criticize Israel in public. But that doesn't mean that they have abandoned Israel, right? What it means instead is that how they're expressing their connection has shifted from essentially unequivocal support to critical engagement. The criticism that we here on a regular basis, this is actually a way in which some American Jews express their attachment to Israel. criticism is a way. After all, think about it. You don't criticize things you don't care about, right? We're more critical of our friends or our family members, precisely because we do care about our friends and our family members, right? So it's because American Jews care about Israel that they criticize it. Criticism isn't an expression of a lack of care or concern. It's a critical component of what it means to care. So that's, I think, the broad shift. Now, when it comes to young American Jews in particular, they are, and I'm talking here about liberal and progressive young, I'm not talking about young Orthodox American Jews. I'm focusing here on the 90%, not that 10% of the Orthodox community. They are the most critical of Israel, and I'm sure that's not a surprise to you. And there are a number of reasons why young American Jews have become particularly critical. First of all, they are more liberal than their older counterparts. They're more likely to identify as liberal than older, just as young people in general in the United States are more liberal, right, than older Americans. Second, their understanding of Judaism and their Jewish identities is much more universalistic, right? The kind of Judaism, the American Judaism that they were raised on, is one in which universalism and social justice is at the very heart of their Jewish identities, okay? And that also applies to how they relate to Israel, where the commitment to universalism and social justice shapes their relationship with Israel. And third, they also look at Israel through a very different lens, right? How we look at Israel is shaped by the formative experiences we've had regarding the country. What happened, just the same is true of how we look at our own societies, right? So there's this idea that sociologists have developed called generational memory. And the idea is basically that different age cohorts, depending on what period of time you were born in, the events that happen in your adolescence and early adulthood, those events shape your political outlook. Right? So we can talk about generational differences. Okay, it's true when it comes to Americans. You know, if you came of age during the Great Depression, for example, you're going to have different priorities, right, than if you came of age during a period of great affluence. So when it comes to Israel, Jews who came of age politically during the 1960s, for example, right, who lived through and remember the Six-Day War or the Yom Kippur War, that shapes their perception of Israel, not just in that moment in time, but throughout the rest of their lives, right? They see Israel through that because that's when our relationships and our outlooks and our political identities are forged. So for young American Jews, they've come of age during a very different time. They look at Israel through a very different lens, right? They don't have a memory of the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, or even of the Oslo peace process. Rather, they have come of age during the Second Intifada and during a time where Israel has been battling militants in the Gaza Strip. So their perception of Israel is shaped by those events. They have a very different generational memory. For them, Israel has always been a military power, a superpower in the region, and a focus of controversy. But young American Jews, young liberal and progressive American Jews, aren't just critical of what Israel does, like older American Jews, right? They're not just critical of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians. They are increasingly critical of Israel's very identity as a Jewish state. This is a shift. Okay, the need for Israel to be a Jewish state, the importance of a Jewish state is less clear to them. Zionism is less appealing to them. And there's a number of reasons for why I think that is the case. First of all, of course, distance from the Holocaust, right? The support for a Jewish state within the American Jewish community was primarily a result of the Holocaust. Before the Holocaust, before World War II, there was not widespread support for Zionism within the American Jewish community. Certainly not among Reform Jews, okay? But as a result of the Holocaust, that really convinced Jews in the United States and around the world of the need for a Jewish state. As we grow more distant from it, okay, then the need, the importance, the rationale for a Jewish state becomes less pressing. Second, for many young American Jews, the fact that Palestinians don't have a state of their own, and the fact that Israel continues to occupy the West Bank, now more than 55 years, that calls into question in their mind the very legitimacy of Zionism. Right? As they see it, if it's not enough for Jews to have a state for Zionism to be legitimate, it must also be, Palestinians must also have a state. That Jewish statehood cannot come at the expense of Palestinian statelessness, right? And so that also leads them to question the legitimacy of Zionism, as does the image of Zionism that is conveyed to them, which is primarily of the Jewish secular movement, of Jewish seculars. That's who seem to be the majors, not those Sabra working on the kibbutzes in the 1960s who kind of embody literally what Zionism represents. Okay, rather it is Jewish seculars in the West Bank who now embody, in the eyes of young American Jews, what Zionism represents. In addition to that, the version of Zionism that was most appealing to American Jews and Jews elsewhere, liberal Zionism, that version of Zionism is endangered, right? A large part of the reason for why the Zionist left has declined, both in the liberal Zionists, has declined in the diaspora and especially in Israel itself, is because of the collapse of the peace process and essentially the collapse of hopes for a two-state solution. Liberal Zionism was premised on the idea that, you know, Jews could have their state, and alongside that there would be a state for the Palestinians, right? That Zionism didn't have to entail statelessness or endless conflict. Those beliefs are being questioned, they're being challenged. I mean, I'll talk maybe in the question in the Q&A about the current Israeli politics, but liberal Zionists, right, those who embody their idea are now just a tiny fraction in the Israeli parliament today. The Labour and Meretz parties, which really represent that, Meretz isn't even in the new Knesset, and Labour has been reduced to just 4 Knesset members, 4 parliamentary seats, much smaller than the ultra-Orthodox. Another reason why I think younger Jews are turning away from Zionism is because out of kind of anger, a sense of betrayal of what they were taught or not taught in Jewish schools, day schools, summer camps, and youth groups. There was a feeling, and I hear this very frequently from students, Jewish students of mine, the feeling that they were basically sold a bill of goods, that they were not taught the truth. Instead, they were taught an idealized, sanitized version of Israeli history. And when they are confronted with a different version, as they often are when they go to college, they feel that, you know, we were lied to. And there's this kind of anger, sense of betrayal, and therefore that leads some to just decide to walk away, to abandon that. And finally, and we've heard a lot about this in recent years, is the fact that Zionism itself, the very word, the ideology, has become, to put it mildly, controversial on college campuses today, right? It is not fashionable, to put it mildly, to identify publicly as a Zionist on college campuses. Zionism is increasingly equated with colonialism, with racism, even with white supremacism. And some Zionist students, some Jewish students who identify publicly as Zionists may face social exclusion or ostracism. So again, it's not comfortable, convenient, popular, or fashionable in the way that it once was in the 1960s, where it became, as I said, much more hospitable to express Zionism. So I think there is a change taking place, and even among a younger generation, as I said, toward questioning the very need for Israel as a Jewish state. So let me conclude then with looking ahead. I described what's happened over really the last few decades, right? A shift from unconditional support to critical engagement. Does that mean then that, you know, things will continue in that vein? I think not. I think actually the Biner and Gordises of this world may be more right about the future than they are about the present, right, in terms of predicting where things are going. I think if current trends continue, there is a growing risk of alienation, not just of distancing and not just criticism, okay? First, because there is a sense, a widespread sense, that Israel and the American Jewish community are moving in opposite directions, okay? Israel is becoming more religious and more right-wing, and American Jews, for the most part, are becoming more secular and more progressive, more liberal, okay? Just look at young people in particular. Young Israeli Jews are more right-wing than older Israeli Jews and more religious, right? And as they grow up, okay, that suggests that that Israel will become more right-wing and more religious. Young American Jews, as I said, are more secular and more liberal than older American Jews. So as they grow up, and right, the community will become more secular and more liberal. So there's this moving apart. Okay, I think there is a great disappointment, frustration that many liberal American Jews feel with the political trends in Israel. Okay, some of you may feel that. And that's because the right in Israel looks to be dominant, not just as a result of one election, but there is this sense that right-wing dominance will continue for years to come, largely due to demographics in Israel. Okay, the increasing power and growth of the ultra-Orthodox in Israel. They now number just around 12% of Israeli society, but 50% of Israeli Jews entering school are ultra-Orthodox, school age. So you can see that over time they will grow as a share of the population. So I think there's a sense among many liberal American Jews that basically this isn't the Israel that we knew and loved. This is a different kind of country. In terms of Israel's policies, I think there's two policies or actions that will have a major impact: how Israel treats the Palestinians and how Israel treats the non-Orthodox, Reform and Conservative Jews. These two things will shape also this sense of alienation. If Israel continues to maintain its occupation over the West Bank or annexes officially de jure annexes the West Bank without enfranchising Palestinians, that is going to alienate liberal American Jews. That it directly violates their own understanding of liberalism. That if you live in a country that rules you, you should have the right to vote for its governments. You should have a say in its policies. Okay. Now, up until now, that has not disturbed American Jews because they believe, well, that the fact that Palestinians in the West Bank can't vote for Israel, that will be resolved by the establishment of a Palestinian state, right? That's one of the reasons why they supported so strongly for so long a two-state solution, because that would solve the problem. But if a two-state solution is no longer possible, right? If a two-state solution is no longer believed to be feasible, then what? Then you have this fundamental clash between this liberal value of equal citizenship and equality and the reality of ongoing occupation. Similarly, in terms of the treatment of non-Orthodox Jews, this is another issue, along with Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, that greatly disturbs liberal American Jews. And if Israel moves in the direction of becoming more pluralistic in terms of its treatment of non-Orthodox Jews, then I think that will improve relations. But if it moves in the other direction, as I think it's likely to do in the weeks, months, and years to come, with the growing power of the ultra-Orthodox, then that will in fact lead to, I think, more alienation, particularly if American Jews conclude that criticism is futile. So as I said, being unhappy with Israel's policies or actions doesn't lead to alienation, it's led to criticism. But if that criticism is believed to be pointless, if it falls on deaf ears, if it makes no difference, if American Jews feel that nobody's listening, their views, their values aren't of any interest, then I think it can. Then instead of criticism, we'll see alienation. So that's one of the factors. Another, I mentioned at the beginning of my talk how attachment to Israel is also a function of attachment to Jewish life in general, right? To put it simply, the more Jewish you feel, the more you're tending to be attached to Israel, right? The less important being Jewish is to you, the less attached to Israel you're likely to be. And the trends in the United States within the American Jewish community point to growing secularism and a decline of kind of strong sense of Jewish identity and Jewish involvement among the non-Orthodox, right? So that also indicates that over time, there may be a weakening of attachment to Israel. And I think finally, another factor which leads me to predict that alienation may increase is the basic reality that American Jews and Israeli Jews live in fundamentally different worlds, right? It's in every respect. Their social worlds are different, their political circumstances are different. Just consider the fact that most American Jews in the United States make up just 2% of the population. So liberalism isn't just like a nice idea, right? It's an insurance policy, right? American Jews need liberalism and recognize that just because in general, as a small minority, right, liberalism can protect you. The belief that everybody has equal citizenship, separation between church and state, these ideas are very essential for American Jewish survival and belonging in the United States. American Jews have many non-Jewish friends, even family members nowadays, right? So the boundary between Jews and they don't look at non-Jews as threatening, right? They don't look at non-Jews as potential threats. It's completely acceptable, right? There's a general sense that the world around them isn't hostile. Whereas if you think about Israel, Israeli Jews constitute the overwhelming majority of the population, 80%. Liberalism then doesn't seem necessary. What's increasingly popular in Israel is majoritarianism. What the majority says or wants goes, even if that means trampling over the rights of minorities. Most Israeli Jews, or very few Israeli Jews, have non-Jewish friends, let alone family members. There is basically no intermarriage, right? So the world that they grew up in is a world surrounded by Jews where the non-Jews, Arabs or Palestinians, are seen as threatening. So is there any wonder then that the two communities are going to look at the world very differently and really find it challenging to relate to each other? In some sense, that process of distancing is to some extent inevitable. So to conclude then, I would say that although in the last few decades, there's been this shift toward critical engagement and criticism, I'm not as confident that that will continue to be the case in the years to come. I think in the years to come, particularly for younger American Jews, who anyway are less attached to Israel, and anyway see less need for a Jewish state, there's a growing danger of distancing and alienation. On that happy note, I will be happy to take your questions. Yes, sir. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. I'm one of those secular people, but my own life has almost been guided by the Holocaust. I'm also pretty old. So what about my big concern right now is how this measly 2% is being, anti-Semitism is on an incredible rise, right? We all know that. Do the youth you've been talking about so much, do they understand what's happening right now? Camp Auschwitz, 6MNWE.
Yeah, so I could give I'm actually working on my next book is about anti-Semitism. So I think just to answer your question, yeah, I do think young people absolutely are aware of this. I mean, this is a major concern. It's become, I would say, the biggest concern in the American Jewish community today. Fears about that, and young Jews absolutely are aware of that. There's a lot of survey data which shows the very, very high level of concern, and that if anything, interestingly, the survey data, like the AJC survey, shows that actually on when it comes to anti-Semitism, liberal Jews are more concerned about anti-Semitism today than Orthodox, and Jews who are politically liberal are more concerned than conservative Jews. So there's a lot of concern, but that does not lead people to become more supportive of Israel. There's not a sense, at least not yet, and I doubt it will happen, where as American Jews become increasingly concerned about anti-Semitism in the United States, that increases their support for Israel because Israel is seen as an insurance policy. Right? It's striking, in fact, over the last few years, how while concerns about anti-Semitism have skyrocketed, immigration, aliyah to Israel has not increased at all. Right? And basically the only Jews who make aliyah to Israel are really Orthodox in any significant numbers. So, and I think many young American Jews, what it's leading, if anything, is not to a renewed commitment to Zionism, because Israel is not seen as a safe haven for Jews, right? Rather, what it's leading to is, I think, a shift, even more focus on what's happening here than in Israel. That basically, in the past, and even including in the recent past, there was a sense, I think, that, well, we were fortunate, we are secure, we are safe, we are prosperous, and therefore we can afford to focus our political energies on Israel. Well, that becomes our focus because we are extremely fortunate, the most fortunate perhaps Jewish community in history, even as many American Jews see it. That sense of therefore we can focus elsewhere, we have the kind of luxury to not have to worry about our own rights and security. We can worry about Israel's security. That I think is gone. And so increasingly, if anything, growing fears about anti-Semitism today have actually encouraged that kind of focus away from Israel, because many people, especially young Jews, thought we need to be paying attention. We need to focus our energies not on mobilizing for Israel, but mobilizing to fight anti-Semitism. Yes.
Just an hour ago, I received on my cell phone a message that said, from the Republican Jewish Coalition. The Republican in chief says, Jewish people don't appreciate Israel the way they should. This is from the anti-Semitism-ist in chief. I would like you to address that.
Yeah, so former President Trump, as I'm sure we all know, has made comments like this on multiple occasions, basically bemoaning that what he sees as the kind of lack of gratitude toward him from American Jews, that he thinks that, everything he's done for Israel should have earned him the undying love and gratitude and appreciation from American Jews, and the fact that they continue to vote for Democrats and not for him is obviously, every time he's before a Jewish audience, he brings this up. So it's really, even though he's been told multiple times, it's offensive, and it plays upon a stereotype, and it doesn't matter. He really, and I think part of the reason for that, I'm not going to excuse this, but I think part of it is because he was told, no doubt by many of the Jews in his orbit, that Israel is what they all care about, that Israel is, and that, if you want to make Jews happy. So to some extent, I think he's kind of can't comprehend it, because the Jews who are more conservative or Orthodox in his immediate orbit are ones who do generally say, if you did this for Israel, this would be great. The liberal American Jews do not vote. The vast majority of American Jews do not vote based upon what they think is good for Israel. Like, setting aside, and whether what Trump did as president was good for Israel or not, I actually are of the opinion that certainly some of it, like the Abraham Accords, was undoubtedly good, and the Trump administration deserves credit for the Abraham Accords. although they weren't peace agreements, but they're still very important. On the other hand, in other areas, like in Syria or in Iraq, or in withdrawing from the nuclear agreement, in other ways, I think it's actually undermined Israel's interests. So the question of how great a president he was for Israel is one issue. But the point is that even if they thought he was a great president for Israel, Israel is not what motivates American Jews at the ballot box. American Jews are American. They're most concerned with the issues that concern other Americans. Israel is low down. So first of all, it is a complete misreading of Jewish political behavior to believe that if you do X or Y for Israel, you're going to get the votes of Jews. That is complete. There is no Jewish vote, right? There is Jewish Americans voting as Americans. Now, it's true that if they believe that there was a president who was completely hostile to Israel, but such a candidate is unlikely to emerge in a presidential election. So there's that. But I think whether it's anti-Semitic or not, it is anti-Semitic to assume that all Jews are attached to Israel or care about Israel, right? Because it evokes this dual loyalty, this claim that Jews are not fully American. And I think in many ways, when Trump evokes that, he's not accusing Jews of being disloyal to the United States. He's not make the accusation that was once made against Jews by anti-Semites that they're disloyal. He's criticizing them for not being loyal enough to Israel, right? But to Israel, he's saying that liberal Jews should be more loyal to Israel, not less. So that's an inversion of the dual loyalty trope, right? He's actually kind of not criticizing, attacking Jews for their loyalty to Israel, saying they should be more loyal. And I think in many ways it's because his understanding of America is that is essentially a kind of white Christian nation. And so Jews are a national minority, right? As there are other groups, they're like minority. And therefore he just thinks that, according to a kind of stereotyped idea, therefore they must be just as like Irish Americans are probably attached to Ireland, or Italian Americans. And it may be, so I don't think it's outright anti-Semitism in his own understanding, even though I think it is offensive to many American Jews, understandably. But it is accurate that, most American Jews didn't overwhelmingly, he's deeply unpopular within the American Jewish community. And in fact, the survey showed at the time that even when he moved the US embassy to Jerusalem, most American Jews actually criticized a lot of these things. So that even in terms of what he did for Israel wasn't as popular among American Jews, because most American Jews are more dovish, right, on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict than Republican policy.
He's talking to the Philo Center.
Somebody else get in
Yes.
I'd like to say first, I was very impressed with your lecture. Very, very impressed. But one of the things which I'm concerned about is for the first time in Israeli politics, a prime minister like Netanyahu, he ended up aligning himself with Trump. And wouldn't you think that would cause the liberal Jews to be alienated from Israel?
Yeah, I think the sources of that alienation go beyond Netanyahu. I think, certainly his kind of alliance with Trump, that kind of, definitely encouraged more criticism and to some extent alienation, particularly for younger American Jews, who don't have that long memory. So I think, yes, it definitely was unpopular. And more importantly, it wasn't just with Trump. Netanyahu just over the weekend gave a video address to the RJC convention. He has, I think, in a very unhelpful manner, injected a lot of political partisanship in the American-Israeli relationship. Basically, there was an attempt among Republicans to turn Israel into a wedge issue, right? In the hopes that will get some Jews who were previously voting for the Democrats to vote for the Republicans. This is a deliberate strategy, which, you know, if I'm a Republican, it makes sense, right? Because you want to win an election and you want to choose an issue that you can peel away some or either Jewish voters or donors, right? Which would be both bad for Democrats. So it makes it, but the fact that Netanyahu, who should care about the wider should care about the interests of American Jews, but also should care about making sure that the US-Israel relationship remains bipartisan and not become a partisan issue, which is happening. I think it's deeply irresponsible for him to so blatantly and publicly align with the Republicans, aside from Trump, who is, of course, a very unpopular figure. So, yeah, I think it does encourage that alienation. As I said, even if Trump or Netanyahu wasn't on the scene, you know, I still think there would be some of this happening, but absolutely it's exacerbated. What I think has been what it's done mostly is increase the divide that Democrats feel against Israel, or Democrats moving away from Israel, and that includes many Jews. So the partisan divide that's emerged, with Democrats becoming much more critical of Israel, more sympathetic to Palestinians, that I think has been partly as a result of Netanyahu's behavior. Yes.
Yeah, I'm glad you're writing a book about anti-Semitism. I'll read it with great interest. Partly, my question is really, what's the definition of it anymore? Is it a useful concept at all? Because you have, as the gentleman said, anti-Semitism from the right, which we're all concerned about, for Charlottesville and so on, and these kinds of statements, mostly from, I think, Christian right-wingers. But then you have what's been called, what pro-Israeli Jews are calling anti-Semitism of the left, which is directed against the American Jews most critically engaged with Israel. So in that case, it seems like it's a concept that's falling apart.
Yeah, you'll have to have me back to give a whole talk on this because it is. But yeah, I think, you know, what we're seeing today is, you know, many debates. I think there's a general consensus that anti-Semitism is rising. Although, you know, I think there's some debate as to how worried we should be, right? But that there is a rise in anti-Semitism, at least as measured by anti-Semitic acts, incidents, and hate crimes. There is a general agreement about that. There is a general agreement that this is a bad thing. You know, nobody's really celebrating the rise of anti-Semitism. But what is considered to be anti-Semitic, what's defined as anti-Semitic, is the subject of deep debate, both within the Jewish community and beyond, and increasing division. I would argue that just as American Jews became divided over Israel over the last few decades, we're now seeing those same divisions play out when it comes to anti-Semitism, right? And it's largely a function of the divisions over Israel. So the argument, the focus of the argument today is, you know, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitic? And, you know, there is a long effort to essentially equate the two, to say anti-Zionism is synonymous with anti-Semitism. I think, you know, if I had to very briefly, quickly weigh in on this debate, I think it's the wrong question to say, is it or isn't it, right? It's not a binary. The question is, when does anti-Zionism become anti-Semitic, right? So there are forms of anti-Zionism, expressions of anti-Zionism, maybe many expressions that are anti-Semitic, right? And there are also forms of anti-Zionism and expressions of it that are not anti-Semitic. For one thing, there are Jews who are anti-Zionist, and I don't think we want to say that they're self-hating or anti-Semitic, but I also think that, you know, there is a danger on the far left. That doesn't mean to say, I think it's clear, and I'm looking at this evidence, it is clear that anti-Semitism is much more of a problem today on the far right than on the left. That there's a lot, again, the data shows this, right? That there is a more anti-Semitic attitudes among those on the far right, particularly young people on the far right, than there is among people on the far left or young people on the far left. We also know quite clearly that the violent anti-Semitic acts, the actual anti-Semitic violence, has been perpetrated by people on the far right, right? Not just against Jews, by the way, but there's a growth of right-wing terrorism in general in this country and around the world. So all of that is true. That doesn't mean to say that there can never be anti-Semitism on the far left. I think the danger on both ends of the political spectrum, and I'm not suggesting they're equivalent, I think we have to avoid this false equivalency. Where it can occur is in conspiracy theories. So you have among some far left anti-Zionists a kind of appeal of conspiracy theories like the Jewish lobby or the Israel lobby, right? That Israel control, that it was the Israel lobby that drove the United States to invade Iraq, or to pull out of the Iran nuclear accord. Whatever it is, it's now that is close to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, right? So I think the danger, the risk of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories exists in general, and that there are some on the far left who believe these conspiracy theories, even while pronouncing themselves anti-racist. But I definitely think, and I think we need to be very clear that there is, in terms of the threat that we face, the physical threat that we face, it's different on college campuses because there aren't far right, there isn't a lot of far right activity on most campuses, thankfully. But in the United States in general, absolutely, it is from the far right, who ironically, some of them also regard themselves as supporters of Israel. So this idea that, that attitudes to Israel is somehow indicative of attitude towards Jews is not the case. But yeah, I think that things are changing, and in many ways, American Jews today should be, and rightfully, focused on what's happening in this country, because it's not just Israeli democracy that we need to worry about, right? I mean, we do need to worry about Israeli democracy, especially with the next new government, or the likely new government coming in. But we also cannot take for granted American democracy any longer. So in many ways, much as we might be critical of things in Israel, we have to recognize that actually this isn't just an Israeli problem. Far-right extremism is not just a problem that Israelis have. Right? They do have that problem, and these groups are now entering the government. But we also see far-right extremism in the United States as well, and the challenges to democracy are there in both places as well. So in some sense, it should actually, recognition of these shared challenges could maybe encourage a kind of solidarity. But I think, unfortunately, that the likelihood is instead that Americans will be, paying attention here and paying less attention to what's happening over there. Yes.
Yeah. So,
just in front of you, and then I'll ask you. Yeah.
Well, again, thank you for a very informative talk, and you mentioned all sorts of dimensions, many of which I hadn't thought of. So let me add another one just to complicate things, and that is the role of evangelical Christianity. A liberal Jewish Zionist would welcome an alliance or welcome any allies who enthusiastically embrace Israel and affirm its sort of Exodus-style projections and fantasies of what a wonderful country it is and how it's blessed by God and destined by God. And okay, music to my ears. But I have such reservations about evangelical Christianity, especially in its more political and right-wing forms, that I just don't know what to do with this. With this support, like with friends like that, need I worry about enemies? Could you?
Yeah, I mean, no, I think you voiced a sentiment that's widely shared by many American Jews, which is, on the one hand, they may welcome the political support that evangelical Christians in the United States have given to Israel. On the other hand, those same evangelical Christians may be perceived, when it comes to issues within the United States, as antithetical, as representing interests that are completely antithetical to Jews. It's interesting. I mean, when we talk about American, if I was giving a lecture about the United States and Israel, and the in many ways, the strongest Zionists in the United States today are not Jews. They're evangelical Christians, white evangelical Christians specifically, right? In far, far greater numbers, they would say in surveys, that God gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people. Most Jews don't believe that, right? But Christians aren't. The largest, by far, pro-Israel organization in the United States today is not AIPAC or J Street, it's Christians United for Israel. Christians United for Israel, a lobby group that was founded by a evangelical pastor, John Hagee from San Antonio, Texas, has more members than there are American Jews in the United States.
But that's their own agenda.
That's their own agenda. But from Israel's point of view, right? From Israel's point of view, or at least from Prime Minister or soon to be Prime Minister Netanyahu's point of view, that is important because if you look at the numbers, it doesn't matter. I mean, I hate to say this, it's painful to acknowledge this, but it really doesn't matter that much to Israel whether liberal American Jews support it or not.
So that's
It really doesn't matter. What matters in terms of ensuring US government supports Israel and continues to provide aid, diplomatic support, military aid. What matters is the fact that there are 40 million or so evangelical Christians. It doesn't matter if some liberal American Jews lose their love for Israel when you have a much larger community who support. So in some ways, that does also account for why many on the Israeli political right have come to believe that their real allies in the United States isn't us. It's evangelical Christians. Now, actually, I think that's also short-sighted because the next generation of evangelicals, not the current leadership, is actually moving slightly away from that, becoming more critical of Israel and of the focus on Israel and pro-Israelism of evangelical politics in general. So it's not for sure that in the years to come, the evangelical Christian community will be quite as devoted to Israel as they are today. But the fact of the matter is they are Israel's greatest supporters in the United States and not American Jews any longer. Yes.
But isn't the end game of the evangelicals Armageddon? And shouldn't we fear where that kind of power would be pushing the Israeli government?
So I think, it's not actually true that that's the primary reason for evangel. I mean, that's true for some, this kind of, belief that if you could get all Jews to return to the Holy Land, that would bring about the second coming and kind of the, eschatology. But actually, there's a variety of motives that evangelical Christians have, and it depends. For example, the John Hagee, the founder of Christians United, that's not what he preaches. What he preaches is a kind of what's called a blessings theology, where basically the belief is that God blessed the Jewish people, right? As evidence that God has this kind of special relationship with the Jewish people, and therefore, if you treat Jews well, you're going to be well regarded by God, and therefore rewarded not in the afterlife, in the here and now materially. It's a blessings theology, right? And so that's one, basically if we treat the Jews well, God will treat us well. If we treat the Jews badly, God will punish us. Now for others, it's an atonement for Christianity's historic sins against the Jewish people. For others, there's some amount of Islamophobia. Jews and Christians are fighting against this. So there's a variety. Yes, there is an element of that for some evangelical Christians about the belief in bringing about the resurrection of Jesus, but I don't think that's simply the full motive. But I do think that when we talk about evangelical Christian support for Israel, the Israel that they support obviously is the Greater Israel Project, is the idea of Israel occupying and ultimately annexing the entire land of Israel, including the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. And, so if you think that Israel ruling over Judea and Samaria forever while not giving its Palestinian residents equal rights, citizenship, if you think that's a threat to Israel's future, then evangelical support for Israel is not to be welcome because that's what they want. But of course, if you're on the right and you think that Israel should control the Judea and Samaria forever and not give Palestinians equal rights, then you're going to welcome those allies. I think in many ways the divide today is not between Jews and Christians or Israeli Jews and American Jews. It's between secular liberals and conservative and religious conservatives within the American Jewish community, within the Israeli Jewish community, and within American politics in general. We see that is broadly speaking the kind of the battle lines between secular liberals and religious conservatives, and we see it play out. And Israel has become yet another issue on which that battle is being played out.
Maybe just one or two.
Yes.
So, yeah, I echo the thanks for a marvelous talk. Sociologically, you're giving primarily a sociological talk set in the political context. Everything you said made so much sense and said it so much better than I've ever understood it. But not so much politically. That's one thing. And then recently, I moved here from Seattle, so some of this has to do with living in Highland Park next door, which is a special community. But everything you describe about the willingness to be critical of Israel and the increasing criticism of Israel among young people is countermanded by the experience of my children in our local public schools, where the amount of heat and I would say intolerance, but certainly heat and danger of treading on any topic in a history class. If you bring up anything that might have been perceived as critical of Israel, the other students jump all over you. And you realize our Orthodox community does not attend the public schools. And then on college campuses, of course, you get attacked for either side, either speaking up for Palestinian rights or speaking up, either one will get you attacked. So sociologically, in the kitchens and in the, and among the people I know, that trend that you described and the poll numbers show it. But in the public sphere, it does not seem to be the case. And then, of course, on the political stage, it has not been, in the American political scene, it has not been safe to openly criticize Israel for the most part.
So just let me start with the last point. I think that's shifting. I mean, look at the last Democratic primaries, the presidential primaries. You had not only Bernie Sanders, right, but also many of the leading candidates, Elizabeth Warren, as another example, who talked about conditioning aid to Israel for the very first time. So within among Democrats, and they are appealing to Jewish voters, right? I think there is a shift within American politics. I mean, I think what we've seen in American politics, Republicans have become the Israel right or wrong party, staunchly supported, no criticism allowed. Whereas I think within, among Democrats, the fact that somebody running for a president believes that it's now acceptable to question the idea about continued unconditional aid to Israel, I think is telling. But I agree with you that in let's say more in formal or institutional spaces, right, the criticism, the shift that I've described hasn't penetrated all spaces equally. Some synagogues, right, will be more tolerant of criticism than others. Some university campuses, the Hillels, for example, I mean, in many university campuses, Hillels don't, like at mine at UCLA, for example, there's a J Street U group. They're not allowed to hold meetings in the Hillel building, right? So, and let's not forget that the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, which is made up of the heads of 56 Jewish organizations, including from ones we've never even heard of, right? They, a few years ago, rejected J Street's application for membership. So in terms of institutional power and in these settings, it is still controversial. They are still trying to prevent the kind of criticism. So absolutely, I don't want to suggest that this, view that criticism is somehow disloyal is universally accepted, right? I think what I was describing is a shift in attitudes, and and we see it affecting in behavior in terms of like the rise of J Street is an example of that. But absolutely, in certain spaces, that is still not what Jews are being told or allowed to do. So I think that battle is still ongoing in many ways. But I do think even within the mainstream organizations, there's a recognition that if you tell Jews today that being pro-Israel means you can't criticize their government, you're going to lose a lot of Jews. Most American Jews have come to accept that you can be pro-Israel and critical of Israeli governments. The heads of some of these organizations don't, but that's partly because I think donors. In other words, these organizations and many of their most committed members and their donors are politically on the right who aren't comfortable with the criticism. So even though many of the members might be okay with it, they, the complaints, the phone calls, or the emails they're going to get are from ones who said, "How could you have that criticism?" That's so. The organized Jewish world is not a democracy, basically, and so it's not reflecting necessarily what all Jews think. I've been referring to Jewish Americans, not the organized Jewish community, in which I think it is still controversial and sometimes unacceptable. But I think ultimately, that shift is taking place. Yes.
You spoke early in your talk about the alienation between American liberal Jews, and you described the two kind of poles, this Gordis with religiosity and Beinart with political dissatisfaction. And in thinking about it, to me, it seemed like they were kind of a lot of overlap. So rather than being poles of different points of disaffection with Israel, they actually seem pretty close together. So I'm just curious.
Yeah, so I'll tell you what I think where it comes down. So just to repeat the point I was making, that Beinart arguing that is what Israeli governments do, that alienates Israel, and Gordis arguing that it's what Israel is, that alienates it. So the importance of this is, if you take Gordis's position, it doesn't matter if Israel withdrew from the West Bank tomorrow and a Palestinian state is established. It doesn't matter how Israeli governments treat non-Orthodox Jews, right? If they're going to, like the next government might do, like scrap the grandchild clause or impose gender segregation in public life. None of that matters because it's what Israel is. It's what Israel represents, right? So essentially, you're saying, it's not about what the Israeli government does. Beinart is arguing that no, it's what Israeli governments do. So it does make a big difference because one suggests this can be changed by ending the occupation, making peace with the Palestinians, bringing about religious pluralism in Israel. That would all improve the relationship considerably and restore that attachment. Gordis's position is there's nothing that Israel can do because it's what Israel, except to cease to be a Jewish state. And that, in a sense, absolves the Israeli government of any responsibility. Now, where I kind of stand on that is that I think absolutely what Israeli governments do makes a big difference. Because yes, there is some disquiet among young liberal progressive Jews with what Israel is as an ethnic democracy, but it's what gives them that discomfort particularly is because how they see how that ethnic democracy behaves. So I think the idea that, what Israel does makes no difference. I do think, there is a fundamental difference between the two populations in terms of liberalism. And I don't think we can expect Jews in Israel to embrace liberalism in the way that American Jews do. Because as I said, liberalism isn't just a reflection of, we'd like to believe it's a reflection of our Jewishness, but it's also a response to being a small minority, right? And therefore, liberalism is an insurance policy. I don't think that will change, but I do think there are things that the Israeli governments can do, and it's very easy for them to believe that just write off American Jews saying there's nothing we can do. They're just, they just don't like us for who we are.
It's up to your discretion.
Okay. Yes, you had your yes.
So you talked about young American Jews being alienated, turned off by the fact that Israel's not a pure democracy, total democracy. So I have like two really questions. One is, what country really is a true democracy, at least outside the United States, and certainly within 1,000 miles of where Israel is located? So, compared to what? They're not criticizing any of the other Middle Eastern countries for not having any kind of democracy whatsoever. And secondly, what is the alternative? Would they rather see Israel announce, okay, we're going to be a true democracy, we'll give all the Arabs on the West Bank a right to vote, and they could elect an Arab prime minister and an Arab parliament, and we won't have to worry about a two-state solution because there will only be one state, Palestine, and there won't be any Israel. So in a true democracy, that's what likely could end up. So would American Jews prefer that scenario?
Well, I think we've actually got some survey data on this again, which is that there was a recent survey that was conducted after the midterm elections, and it provides those three different scenarios. Israel annexes or controls the West Bank without giving Palestinians their equal citizenship or the right to vote. Israel withdraws from most of the West Bank, and there's a Palestinian state alongside Israel, right? Or Israel enfranchises all the Palestinians in the West Bank. So about 60%. This was not by age of Jewish Americans respondents. This is a representative sample. Wanted, unsurprisingly, the two-state solution, right? That would be the best way. That way you can have Israel as a Jewish state and be a democracy and have the Palestinians have their own state. About 25%, so that's about 60%, right? 25% said Israel to annex the whole West Bank without giving Palestinian citizenship, right? Which would be the most, an undemocratic, obviously, what some might call apartheid, right? 25% of American Jews in that survey supported that, and just 15% supported the idea of giving Palestinians citizenship in this one state. So support for a one-state solution with equal citizenship for Palestinians is at the moment the least popular option. The most popular is a two-state solution. The problem, of course, is that a two-state solution may not be possible. That will be another lecture, but a two-state solution, even if it's one that most Jews would want, including young American Jews, because that's the way that you can have these two things that you care about, there is, I think, understandably, great deal of pessimism about the prospects for that. So we are moving to the point, if we're not already there already, where we will have to make a very difficult choice between not can we have the two state, but which one state we would support. One state with equal rights, which would mean potentially the end of Israel as a Jewish state, right? Or a one state with no equal rights, which would mean no democracy. I think many American Jews, given their commitment to liberalism, will choose over time, if that probably the one state with equal rights over the Jewish state. But that is unfortunately, tragically, that is the choice. Just to very quickly on your first point, it's true that of course there's no perfect democracy. Democracy isn't an either-or proposition, right? There is, we've seen the United States very clearly how flawed American democracy is. So I think that's absolutely true. But there is, in the case of Israel, it is unusual. It's not just a flawed democracy. It is a flawed democracy within the Green Line in terms of the equal citizenship. But it is unusual insofar as it has maintained an occupation for 57 years, for most of its history, without giving rights to the people under occupation. That is not the same as the United States, or it is true in the past, but no longer. So I think there is a difference. I don't think it's just right. We could just say, well, all democracies have their imperfections. Maintaining military rule over a population for 5 decades isn't just a kind of an imperfection. It is. It does have a major flaw. So I think, as I said, that conflict between our commitment to democracy which is deep because it's what ensures our rights here in the United States, our commitment to democracy, our commitment to liberalism, and our support for Israel as a Jewish state. In the past, we hadn't had to choose between these things. And I fear that we are now entering an era in which we will be increasingly torn between those two commitments. We know there will be some Jews who will choose Israel as a Jewish state, those 25%. They're mostly the politically conservative and orthodox. And the others who currently, the 60% who want a two-state solution, what will happen if and when they conclude that two-state solution is not longer possible? So I'd like to leave you on that.
Thank you again, Dr. Waxman. While I have you all here as captive audiences, I have two shameless plugs to make. Just because we like bringing multiple views and multiple ways of thinking about these issues to light, please join us on December 9th, 10th, and 11th for our Reitman Memorial Scholar and Residence Weekend, as we bring in Professor Gil Troy from McGill University, whose topics will include redefining Zionism for a new generation and the history of Reform Zionism as the history and future of American Zionism. So the conversation will continue. Also, considering you led into it earlier with a statistic on how many people have gone to visit Israel. We do have an Israel trip coming up next year. We are about a bus and a half full, so if you're interested in coming to Israel with Rabbi Miller and myself, please follow the link that's in your weekly emails or in the bulletin to sign up to come with us to Israel. It's going to be a great and fascinating trip as we continue these conversations on what does it mean to be American Zionists while being in the state of Israel. So thank you again to the Schrager family for another wonderful lecture series. And now we're going to have to think about what we're going to do next year. So thank you all.
Your third flush.
What is everybody's